Welcome back, MSP friends. We're getting to part 3 of our on-site service and revenue myths series. In this video, we're going to be talking about that permanent or semi-permanent resource replacing on-site. That thing that is almost staff hog. In fact, it might actually be staff hog. We're going to talk about some of the ways that it actually can work pretty well, but some of the pitfalls you have to be careful of. This one's the sneaky one, because the other two examples we gave in the previous videos of regular on-sites and then the recurring on-site, I think most of my objections, the average MSP will understand why I'm concerned about them. But this model at front side, especially if the client's willing to pay for it, doesn't seem like there's a lot of risk to the business at first. And that's where it gets sneaky. So let's get into it, friends. This is the one where it's not that superficially dissimilar from what we just talked about with the strategic recurring on-site to take care of a predetermined low risk, no SLA set of recurring tasks. This typically is most commonly seen when you have a larger client, not necessarily larger client like the client is huge, but larger client for you that has more mature demands where the perception of availability starts to become important. So these are those clients that maybe it's co-managed, maybe they do have some internal IT resources. The idea isn't that your remote services are insufficient for user support. In fact, they probably are. The idea here is more that 7-Eleven concept where 7-Eleven changed to being open 24/7 and the perception they were available at any time increase the daytime traffic. It's that. It's when that client basically says, I would love to have a member of your team in our office on a recurring basis for this period of time that either is at a desk or in an office and is available should anyone need them. It's a perception of availability staffing metric. For exceptionally large clients, sometimes it does start to drift into actual capacity where simply the number of employees that have small incidents that require a rapid response are not commensurate with whatever your remote model is. So that's where it starts to really turn into proper staff aug. But in any case, what we're really doing here for most MSPs is staffing the perception of availability by dedicating a resource to be on site. And in most cases, until they become a fully dedicated resource, the way we justify this and offset the cost and therefore our profits and our margin is by getting the client to agree that if I leave Timmy on site or Susie on site for 4 hours or 8 hours, if they're not being utilized by that client, they can work on other tickets. Therefore, I won't charge you a full staff aug rate. That's not entirely uncommon. What problems could I possibly have with all of that? So first and foremost, same thing you've heard over and over again, and especially at the smaller MSP or the less mature MSP. And I don't say that in a negative way, just an MSP that has less resources and less time to invest in process. You're literally robbing yourself. There's the opportunity cost, but you're robbing yourself of having complete control over what is likely a relatively high value resource. I know you've agreed to the client they can work on other things remotely while they're there, and that will happen sometimes. The client they're on site with gets priority first. And so you start dipping your toes into this area where the on-site client really gets first call on managing order of operations and sort of SLA on that relatively valuable resource you have on site. That's very, very, very tricky to manage. That takes an incredibly high maturity planning and management skill set that smaller MSP likely doesn't have. And so it then falls either entirely on the shoulders of that employee that's on site, and the likelihood that they're able to manage that completely on their own is very unlikely. And so what usually ends up happening is that employee is going to feel hyper incentivized to either make the people they're in front of happy, which means they really won't do much other work for you, which means you won't really offset the cost at all. Or if they don't have that social and client management skill set, they're going to hide. And eventually it's going to aggravate that client and once again, diminish any value that anyone was hoping to achieve here. And so nothing really comes of this other than you're losing money, losing out on that employee and devaluing your overall expertise in front of the client. Because remember, once I'm on site, I have to be the best version of my MSP the entire time I'm on site with everything. That doesn't just mean tickets. That means no clogging the toilet. That means no stinky food in the break room there. That means not being messy. That means being presentable. That means not taking a customer's parking spot. That means so many other subtle, nuanced things to not make yourself stand out as anything other than an in-house employee, but yet keep the crowbar that you're not. That takes an exceptional skill set to manage. And the smaller MSP, you usually just either don't have that skill set or don't have the weight of process to make up for it. So generally speaking, even if it was priced appropriately, this often fails at that small MSP. At that medium MSP, that's probably somewhere around that like 30 employee mark, this is more frequently where we tend to see this implemented. And it is a little bit more likely that you have enough process and hiring depth where the level of person you put on site is a little bit more of your choice. And they're very likely maybe a little bit more process maturity for that person to rely on. But you still have those same problems where a fractional person on site who has the perception of availability, it only works if they're actually technically available for the entirety of that time, which means every time I say I'll be with you in a minute, I'm working on something, if that what they're working on isn't for me and I can't see it, I'm going to feel like they weren't available. And so the value drift over time gets pretty significant and you get a die off on what it's worth. And especially if what they're paying to you, the client's going to reach a point where they're just going to want to bring someone in house or dedicate this employee full time. And if they dedicate them full time, they're going to base that off what you already charged and just sort of adjust for the hours. And well, you already gave them a break because if you priced it appropriately, this kind of engagement they would have said no to. So it's something you really want to keep your eyes on. You really are not going to be able to leverage this person for other tasks in any meaningful way. They really do kind of have to just be infinitely available the whole time they're there. And they need to be able to represent the totality of your MSP at a higher than average level that entire time. It's very expensive to do even if at that medium level. Although at that medium level, you may have convinced yourself that's the only way I can get this higher revenue client in the door. I don't agree with that kind of thinking, but if that is what you've done, make sure that what you're charging is enough to make that worthwhile, because the longer you do this for, the less value doing this will have. So now let's talk about this at the much more mature or larger MSP where the tone starts to shift. So as you start to get to the point where you are effectively able to properly designate this resource being on site in this sort of either full or semi-staff aug role, where you no longer need to split them between doing in-house things for other clients and stuff on site, where you can actually, from an opportunity cost standpoint, Timmy, you are on site for 16 hours a week, and I've already accounted for that in my staffing. So there's effectively no more opportunity cost to the rest of the company. Something interesting can start to happen, and it can either be something really, really cool that can become a really new business model for you, or it can actually start to become a way that you start losing by no immediate fault of your own, these really high value, large clients. What'll start happening is as Timmy no longer has, or Susie no longer has this idea and this language, and your agreement no longer has this language, this is a shared resource that is being given at a discount for the convenience of the client now starts to view this as proper staff aug, whether it is or it isn't. And they start to feel that they are paying a fair amount to have full use and control of this person while they're on site. And that can lead to some interesting and problematic things you have to keep an eye on. The lowest hanging fruit there is eventually, if I get used to the fact that every week or every day, Susie or Timmy is in the room down there and they work for my MSP and their hours for half a day. Well, what's easier? Submitting a ticket into the ticketing queue, getting an auto response, waiting for the FCR team or the level 1 help desk to call in, troubleshoot, and escalate it? Or I just kind of saunter on down to Timmy or Susie's desk when my mouse stops working and ask them if they have a minute. That starts happening really frequently. And so initially this can seem kind of cool, but what'll end up happening is Susie or Timmy becomes a problem ticket deflection issue. They go from being an efficiency ticket deflection to too many tickets get deflected to them and then are forced on them to report into the system. And that robs you of a lot of things as an MSP at that level. It robs you completely of your ability to manage SLAs entirely. The entire front end of your SLA is just vaporized. You have no control over it. You lose the ability to decide who's going to work things in what order and assign it to the most effective resource. And you lose the ability to leverage the front side of all of your process and automation you've put in to drive down the support cost. So you weirdly enough, by doing this, take what was probably previously a client you've had for a while that was pretty efficient to support and was probably reasonably profitable because of the time you'd invested, and you actually start undoing that and turning this back into what one of these clients would have looked like when you were like a 5-person MSP. And it can happen very, very subtly and very insidiously while everybody's smiling, because the entire time in the immediacy, everybody's kind of happy about this. Timmy or Susie feel really valued. You're happy the client's engaging with them, and the individual users are happy they have somebody to walk and talk to. So in the short term, it seems positive, which is why it sneaks up on you. And you have a much slower drop off on this than some of the other things I've talked about. But over time, you'll start to find that they start under leveraging the actual MSP itself to the point where it's now no longer in service of the client. They're waiting to have things solved. Their risk starts to drift from the standard you've arrived at, and their user experience actually starts to decline. And they're not probably going to blame Timmy or Susie, because remember, Timmy or Susie works there. They like them. They're going to start to blame you. The shift inside the organization starts to look at like, well, Timmy or Susie's one of us. It's that dumbass MSP that backs them up. You know, if we could just hire Timmy or Susie, this would be great. Or if we could just keep Timmy or Susie and hire another MSP, this would be great. And as soon as the bulk of the staff think that way, you're done. You're churning the client. You may not churn it in that moment, but you are done. There is almost no way to recover from that. If the decision makers feel that way, but the staff doesn't, that's recoverable. But if the staff at a company, especially a large company, all feel that the only part of your MSP that's worth a damn is the augmented staff person in their office, and the rest of you is completely useless, they don't even interact with you, you have churned the client, and it's just a matter of time until the executive team comes over to you and says, ooh, sorry, we're not renewing. That is a huge risk you run here. It's very challenging to navigate. I don't have an immediate magical solution for that. You can rotate people in and out of the role. That helps a little bit, but this almost certainly can happen over time. If you do fully dedicated and augmented staff, at that point, maybe that shift is part of your strategy, and you're going to approach this more as a proper co-manage with staff aug, and that's not part of the scope of this call. But most of us who start doing this, that wasn't our intention to begin with, and we didn't price it that way to begin with. A third problem that really starts to impact and come up on the skill set of the person in the staff aug role. So think of this. Think of a totally different context. If you think of people who foster dogs or cats or other animals or children, long-term fosters, you start to grow an attachment to the thing you're fostering. It's not yours. You know it's not yours. You're kind of taking care of it in service of someone else, but you grow attached anyways, which is why it's so common that people who do long-term fostering adopt whoever or whatever they're fostering, where some agencies have limits on how often you can do that. Well, that exact same concept, that familiarity and comfort and likability and the blurring of who's the owner and who's in charge of the relationship will happen over time with this semi or fully staff aug type of person. Who they report to, who their boss is, who their stakeholder is, that will blur over time unless you are hyper vigilant against preventing it. And most MSPs, as this is not your primary business model, are not really that good at offsetting that from happening. The longer this person is in that staff aug position, whether it's partial day or full day, the more and more and more they're going to start to identify with the culture, the workplace, and the coworkers at the company they're staff auged at. They will start to see the supervisors and managers there as their managers. They will start to then reframe their job and their role around that company first. And there's kind of not much you can do about it once that happens. Once again, if your primary model is staff aug and co-manage, this may be what you want to have happen. And so you're good. But for the rest of us, where that's not our primary model, this is something we're trying to offer to keep this client growing with us. This can actually become a really big risk point, because the only solution to this for either side is to either remove this employee or for this employee to be hired by the client. And in both cases, that is almost certainly going to be a relationship hit that neither side can recover from. If I finally say, listen, like Susie or Timmy, I need to bring them back in-house because honestly, they're not really responding and addressing our standards anymore. And they too much Kool-Aid, like too much Stockholm syndrome. I need to rotate them out. The client's not going to want that. They're going to feel like you're taking something away from them, something they've invested in. You're taking their foster animal or their foster child away from them, someone they would like to adopt. Very hard to overcome that relationship hit. On the flip side, if that client gets to a point, and this is far more likely, where the client really, really likes, Susie or Timmy and just wants to hire them, if you're very, very large and high maturity, you have accounted for this and there will be clauses for this and you will move on with your life and do this. But if you're not, which is most of us, that's going to be very emotionally and mentally challenging for you, the MSP, to get over the fact you're going to feel like the client's being disloyal. You're going to feel like the employee's being disloyal. And you're going to rightly recognize that this probably marks the start of the end of your relationship with this client. Because if this person's that excellent, knows how to do what you know how to do at your MSP, and understands the tools and what their end client needs, well, they don't really need you as a full stack MSP anymore. And there's a risk now introduced. They could find another MSP. They could shift their spend with you to a lower spend. They could switch to a model or reduction of services. And so now it's not only the cost of losing this person and some sort of like non-solicitation buyout fee. There's the almost guaranteed hit to the contract revenue and value that's going to come into play. And once this happens, once again, very challenging to maintain that contract value and revenue unless this is explicitly your business model and you've set this up from the beginning. So a couple of words of caution around that. And so all of that comes back to, since the sort of like semi or fully staff aug idea of having someone on site on a recurring basis where they're available to the to the client in that manner, and otherwise you're a traditional MSP, you're pretty much guaranteeing yourself future pain and risk. So you need to offset that on the front side with the cost. And so that's why it's really important to not play mental games that this is going to lead to more business later, or that you can offset this person by having them do other things. Even if it's a yes to both of those, which is very tenuous and unlikely, still not likely going to offset the ultimate relationship hit to the contract revenue. So you have to start at an appropriate price point for this person as though they were being properly and fully staff auged. And if the client's willing to pay that, then move forward with that. If your MSP can afford the opportunity cost, the client is willing to pay an appropriate rate to have a dedicated resource that you have trained and you are managing and you are guaranteeing you will backfill with someone if they're out sick, and the client is willing to pay for all of that, that still should be less than them hiring a full-time burdened employee for that role. You should be able to communicate that value and get the proper amount of money for that. If you can't, I would be really, really cautious about using this as some sort of excuse that it'll lead to more. It probably almost certainly won't, and it almost certainly will lead to future heartache and an overall reduction, if not elimination, of that contract revenue. If you're a pay-as-you-go or break-fix shop, that's a little bit different. And if you want to have somebody fully dedicated on site from, as long as they're billing properly and the client understands how they're billing while they're on site, that whole piece of it is less of an issue. It's just far more likely the client's going to poach someone they like in that situation, unless you're doing pure as a service staff aug in that area. In every single case, all of the things we've talked about in both videos, I do want to clear this idea out of everybody's head. Having a recurring resource on site or over delivering with frequent on sites is not white glove service. Showing up more often and doing it in front of people is not white glove or high end. It is more expensive and you should charge more, but it is not an indicator of a higher tier of service. And I think that's really important to understand because this industry uses that word a lot to excuse things that are not actually white glove. True white glove service, right, are actual white gloves that do not get dirty and provide a level of perception of the needs where things are so served ahead of time and in real time that as a client, I never have to think or ask or utilize that service. It is effectively invisible due to the quality it is rendered at. And the entire reason all of you want to send someone on site is not that reason. It is not white glove. It can be good customer service and it can be a really good client experience, but it is not in and of itself a white glove differentiator. And I think that's really, really important. A truly white glove MSP with the same problem would find a way to never have to show up on site and predetermine the client's needs before the clients have them and solve the problems before they even come up and have things basically, if they need to go on site, drop ship pre-configured where I simply plugged in a single cord and pressed a button and had a perfect experience. That would be actual white glove, which means nearly invisible service because of the quality and perceptive ability of the service. That is the Alfred the Butler level of service that actual white glove is. That is Alfred knowing what Batman needs before Batman needs it and already having it ready for Batman before Batman asks for it without being seen, so that when Alfred does say something, Bruce Wayne jumps for a minute because he had no idea Alfred was actually there. That is true white glove. Having someone on site for your clients to interact with is literally not that. Just want to make sure everyone understands that. It doesn't mean it's not a good customer experience, not white glove. I hope you got some value from this, and I hope the recurring themes came across that at all sizes of MSP and all revenue models, all maturity models, going on site as a stopgap or a band-aid or on a recurring basis almost never actually has the long-term value that we think it has. And as a result, it has to be priced appropriately. And that means you can't cut anyone any breaks. And if the client is not willing to pay for it, that means there's not actually a need there that this is solving for, which means you are fundamentally not actually adding value. And as a service provider, that is your job on all revenue models, is to deliver value. So if this cannot deliver value to the client and the client will not pay for it, which means it's not delivering value, you have to go back and look and see, is there a different way I could deliver the same value without doing this? And luck would have it, unlike most of the other industries we talked about earlier, for MSPs, the answer is almost certainly yes. Almost certainly yes. There are hundreds of other ways you could deliver the same value you want to deliver without having to send someone on site, which is fundamentally your most expensive, highest opportunity cost, riskiest value interaction you can have as a professional service provider. Have a great Thursday, everybody. Stay profitable. Keep focusing on that client experience. Don't try to solve everything by sending a body there.